Welcome everybody to the second Chancellor David Dodge lecture. My name's Hugh Lloyd-Ellis and I'm the head of the economics department, and I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. First, I'm going to actually want to talk a little bit about the lecture series itself and David Dodge. So the lecture series was created in 2014 at the suggestion of Principal Daniel Wolfe, and with funding commitments from the Smith School of Business, the School of Policy Studies, and the Department of Economics. And it's intended to honor David Dodge, and in particular his role as Chancellor of Queen's from 2008 to 2014. In fact, the inaugural lecture was given last year by Dodge himself. So David Dodge graduated from Queen's, as many of you will know, with an honors degree in economics, and received his PhD from Princeton in 1972. And during his academic career, he was an assistant professor of economics at Queen's, an associate professor of Canadian Studies and International Economics at Johns Hopkins, a senior fellow at UBC, and a visiting professor at Simon Fraser. He also served as director of the International Economics Program of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. In 1992, Dodge was appointed Deputy Minister of Finance, where he played a key role in reviving Canada's economy, working closely with Finance Minister Paul Martin to eliminate the federal budget's deficit spending. In 1998, he was appointed Deputy Minister of Health before becoming Governor of the Bank of Canada in 2001, where he served, as you all know, a 7-year term. After leaving the bank, he joined Bennett Jones, LLP. David Dodge was elected and installed as the 13th Chancellor of Queen's in 2008, and his reappointment for a second 3-year term was unanimously endorsed by the Queen's University Council, and Dodge served in his role until his retirement in June 2014. He was subsequently appointed Chancellor Emeritus by the University Council, an honorary title he still holds today. Often when you're reading these things, the guy's already passed away, but as you know, David Dodge is still with us, so not to worry. During his career, David Dodge received many accolades. In particular, he was made an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2007 and was elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 2009. Unfortunately, David is unable to attend today's lecture. Apparently, he's at the C.D. Howe Institute right now, so they've kind of avoided each other. But he passes on his best wishes to all. So our speaker today is William Robson, President and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute. Bill is a graduate of the University of Toronto and earned an MA from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton. He subsequently worked as an economist with CIBC Wood Gundy and in the Federal Department of Energy, Mines and Resources. In 2000, Bill became Director of Research at the C.D. Howe Institute and subsequently became Senior Vice President. In July 2006, he was appointed as President and CEO of the institution, a position he continues to hold. Bill has written more than 200 monographs, articles, chapters and books on such subjects as government budgets, pensions, healthcare financing, inflation, and currency issues, to name just a few. In 1994, his book, The Great Canadian Disinflation, co-authored with David Laidler, won the Canadian Economics Association's Doug Purvis Memorial Prize for excellence in writing on Canadian economic policy. I believe that was the first time it was awarded. Yeah, I think so. More recently, their book, 2% Target, Canadian Monetary Policy since 1991, won the 2004 Donner Prize for the best book in Canadian public policy. In addition to his role at the C.D. Howe Institute, Bill is a senior fellow at Massey College, holds an ICD.D designation from the Institute of Corporate Directors. I actually looked up what that meant, and it means he's just a great director of something, right? Works well in the boardroom, apparently. And is a member of the Big Picture panel on CBC's The Exchange. He taught public finance and public policy at the University of Toronto from 2000 to 2003 and currently teaches a master's level course in public finance at the University of Toronto's School of Public Policy and Governance. So please join me in welcoming William Robson as this year's Chancellor David Dodge Lecturer.
It really is an honor to speak at an event named for David Dodge. And it's a pleasure to do what's entirely fitting on an occasion such as this, which is to pay tribute to him. Now, Hugh has already said a good deal, and I know many of you in the room know David and know of his accomplishments, and if I were to go over them, it would pretty much exhaust the time that we have here. So let me just underline that in addition to what Hugh said, I have a personal debt to David for the time that he spent as chair of the C.D. Howe Institute's board of directors from 2008 to 2011, and then subsequently he chaired our national council, which he continues to do today. And he is smart, he is wise, and he is passionate about public policy. Now, David's personal integrity and professional accomplishments contrast so utterly with the man whose name I infelicitously link with his in the title of this talk, Charles Ponzi, that I probably should underline a disclaimer. The views you are about to hear are mine. I can't put words in David's mouth. It's interesting that he's at a session at the C.D. Howe Institute, which was on pensions, because David might not agree with some of the things I'm about to say, and he probably would, he certainly would not agree with all of the references to Ponzi. So please give him credit for any insights that I've gained from discussions with him and blame me for any of the gaps and misconceptions. Now, there may be some gaps. I took the invitation to be here today as an opportunity to pursue several strands of my thinking about intergenerational transfers in Canada, and I don't claim to have woven them all together into one fabric. And as for misconceptions, I'm going to watch the clock here. I want to keep to less than an hour of prepared remarks so that there's time for you to challenge me during the discussion. Now, a lecture often proceeds at this point to a detailed outline, but I hope it'll be more interesting for me to proceed directly to the man whose name jars with David's headlining on this august occasion. So, Charles Ponzi. If you don't know, he arrived in North America in 1903, age 21, and he becomes mildly interesting, especially in Canada, in 1907, because that was when he moved to Montreal and got a job with the newly opened Banco Zarossi, which turned out to be a bit of an apprenticeship because the Banco Zarossi was paying 6% interest on deposits, which was well above what its mainstream competitors were offering, by paying depositors not from the proceeds of its real estate investments, which turned out to be largely dud, but from money from new depositors. And it collapsed. Zarossi himself fled to Mexico, and Ponzi then forged a check from one of its customers and spent 3 years in jail. So we fast forward now a few other jobs and crimes and jail terms later. He becomes seriously interesting in 1918 in Boston. And it was there that some correspondents from Europe alerted him to international postal reply coupons. And postal reply coupons were redeemable for stamps to encourage the recipient of a letter to reply. And the exchange rates on these had been fixed by treaty before the First World War, but during and after the war, there were large currency movements. And so buying them in Europe and redeeming them in the United States was profitable. And Ponzi set up what he called the Securities Exchange Company. He advertised 50% profit on your money in 45 days, double it in 6 months. And money began pouring in, and it began pouring in faster than even if he had wanted to. Ponzi could have cycled it through the postal coupon arbitrage, so instead he paid old investors money from new ones. And this activity soon dwarfed the stock of postal reply coupons that was out there. And suspicion, reinforced by some reports from the Canadian authorities about their experience with Ponzi, began to grow, and in 1920, to cut to the chase, the police arrested Ponzi, which involved them having to get past physical attacks by investors waiting in the office for their money, an important detail. So anyway, then it sort of fades out after that. He did another stint in jail. He ended up actually in Brazil working briefly for a state-owned airline, Italian state-owned airline. That ended with the fall of Mussolini. And when he died in 1949, he didn't leave much, but he did leave a name. He left a new name for one of the world's oldest and most pervasive financial scams, the Ponzi game. So why am I sullying this august lecture for David Dodge with this unedifying story? Well, it's because the Ponzi game is one of the oldest and most pervasive scams. As I probably don't need to repeat, but just for emphasis, the essence of a Ponzi game is that at least part of the money that you pay in returns to each participant come not from proceeds on a value-generating activity, but from the next participant's investment. And an investment pool such as Bernie Madoff's, to pick a prominent recent example, that requires new funds flowing in fast enough to pay suitably attractive returns. You need some combination of rising numbers of investors or increased money per investor, because if the inflow of new funds shrinks and you can't pay the superior returns to the alternatives, then you're going to get a vicious circle like a bank run, and the scheme collapses. Now, that seems clear on the face of it, but lots of businesses pay dividends and interest and periodically or regularly raise new capital, equity and debt. And their principles, warming up to an alliterative theme here, could be premeditated Ponzi's, or they could be legitimate bankers, profitably intermediating saving. Any commitment to pay a given return has some potential Ponzi in it. And a bank that's offering deposit rates based on legitimate expectations of returns on its credit portfolio might suffer an impairment on its loans. Or to prefigure a key subtopic for today, a pension plan that's promising benefits based on high yields on safe investments might find that those yields have dropped. So potential then becomes real. You could call that a peradventure Ponzi. I'm trying to stay with the alliteration here. Now, what if a peradventure Ponzi realizes that there's a problem? If you're managing a person in that situation, managing the scheme, will that person just close the doors voluntarily? A supplier, an accountant, or an actuary, will that person blow the whistle? Will an investor? You just have to remember the investors in Ponzi's office who attacked the police trying to stop them from shutting it down, because in a bank run, every depositor wants the doors to stay open long enough to get her or his money out. Participants in a pension plan want it to stay afloat long enough to see them through. So people who know or suspect that there might be a sustainability problem may not call that out. And I was thinking, okay, is that a permissive Ponzi? That sounds a bit passive. Sometimes those people can be a bit pugnacious. So I'm going to call them perpetuating Ponzi's. So one more alliteration, the police. So this is about containing Ponzi. When you look back on Ponzi's scheme or Bernie Madoff, I mean, hindsight tells us they were bubbles, and the police move in and they pop. But other wind downs, even spectacular smashes like the city workers' pensions in Detroit recently, or sovereign defaults, they don't necessarily wipe everybody out instantly. Regulators may accommodate peradventure Ponzi's if they're steered offside by a slump and there's a legitimate expectation that they're going to get back on side. And if you've got an institutional setup that can stanch the withdrawals and potentially bring in some new funds, then you can manage an orderly wind down quite possibly. And government-run schemes, if you've got participation that's mandatory, or if it's a condition of an employment contract, say, then the police, if they're not perpetuating Ponzi's themselves, and they don't succumb to physical attacks, then they can stop or slow the inflation of the bubble. And in a circumstance like that, there will still be losers. I mean, if the early investors and managers extract the unsustainable value, then latecomers are going to go short. But if a workable consensus on spreading the damage across people and over time is possible, then an orderly wind down can avoid a smash. So I've got that alliteration. It's not necessarily elegant, but with any luck, it's memorable. So let's see how Ponzi got into some public programs and what successful police actions we've had, and then what premeditated or peradventure or perpetuating Ponzi's we might still face. I'll pick up where Ponzi left off at the end of World War II, and in this room I know that the story of the following quarter century, when Canada's welfare state largely took shape, is probably more familiar than the Ponzi story. Very quickly, the baby boom drove rapid increases in the working age population. Saving and investment rates were high, so was productivity growth, and we had quite rapid and steady growth in real output and incomes and in government revenues. Another feature of that era, not so widely remarked, is that at the beginning of it, yields on safe assets such as Government of Canada bonds, which were high after the experience of the 1930s and the war, declined. And they fell a long way and stayed low so long that high quality yields on that were lower than economic growth rates for many people started to feel quite normal. And when you've got economic growth above the yield on high quality assets, then the holders of residual claims like common shares do very well. So we had the price of shares went way up and their yields went way down, started above bond yields, finished below it. Now that environment fostered some potential Ponzi's, and I'm going to comment on 4 areas. First, seniors benefits and the CPP. That's an environment in which raising the living standards of seniors, who at the time were quite a bit poorer than the average person, seemed relatively easy. And so the seniors transfers that exist today, OAS, GIS, and then the CPP and QPP started during the 45 to 70 period. And those schemes had trappings of funded programs at the beginning. OAS originally had a dedicated tax. The CPP charges premiums. But pre-funding and actually paying the returns from actual investments didn't seem necessary. And if I call this premeditated Ponzi, I have eminent authority because no less than Paul Samuelson wrote, it's widely quoted, a 1967 Newsweek column in which he wrote about US Social Security that its beauty is that it's actuarially unsound. Everybody who reaches retirement age is given benefit privileges that far exceed anything he has paid in. The national product is growing at a compound interest rate and can be expected to do so as far ahead as the eye cannot see. A growing nation is the greatest Ponzi game ever contrived. Now, leave that for a moment and turn to occupational pensions. Something of the same logic affected occupational pensions. Back then, a lot of private sector pension plans were unfunded, and I think just about every public sector plan in Canada would have been unfunded. So that's premeditated. Some were more peradventure, though, because the extraordinary returns on common shares during that period generated literature on the equity premium. And a generation of pension consultants told their plan administrators that they should hold assets that didn't match their liabilities for the sake of higher returns. And a generation of accountants kind of encouraged that by letting the managers discount their liabilities at rates that reflected the assumed returns on the assets. So that left more room for dividends and wages. And in the case of government worker pensions, potential access to the tax base made liability matching seem even less important. And high discount rates there offered workers more money and taxpayers lower levies. So occupational pensions, that's the second area. I'm going to mention healthcare as well. And this is the period of time when the publicly funded hospital and doctor services that we're familiar with today first became widespread. It's a stretch to call it premeditated Ponzi, and I don't know if there were discussions about pre-funding at the time. But as public finance economists, at any rate, remind their students, government-financed healthcare was initially conceived as social insurance. And provincial Medicare programs had trappings of insurance. They had dedicated premiums. And we didn't have systematic data then, but it wasn't any mystery that costs, though not specified in dollar terms as they would be in a pension plan or a debt security, rise as people get older. So there was a kind of potential Ponzi there. And the final area that I want to mention, the fourth one, is government budgets and public debt. When people talk about fiscal Ponzi games, they're usually focusing on the sustainability of debt servicing. And no wonder, because history is rife with sovereign defaults. First post-war years, simply not an issue at all in Canada. The federal government mainly, but as a result, the public sector as a whole paid down what were sizable debts after the war with very large budget surpluses. And then low yields and rapidly growing revenue alleviated concerns about sustainability. Now, at the end of the period, deficits were beginning to reappear. And if you take a broader view of government, again, this is a bit of a stretch, so I don't want to overstate this, but if you think of governments charging a price, a tax price for services, the emergence of deficits has some parallels with the making of promises that are more valuable than people are willing to pay for. But at the time, this just didn't seem like a concern. Yields were lower than economic growth rates. There was one school of thought, at any rate, that talked about this as dynamically inefficient. It's okay if we bring some consumption forward. Fiscal policy turning saving into consumption is okay. So that sets the stage for the next quarter century. 1970 to 1995, the backdrop changed in very important ways. So going back to the demography, lower birth rates, population growth slowed down, investment rates fell, and productivity also decelerated. So growth of output and income slowed, and yields on high quality assets rose. So you had the reversal of that previous margin of growth rates over yields. That sort of environment puts pressure on Ponzi's, whether they're premeditated or peradventure. And Paul Samuelson, less widely quoted, but in 1985 he wrote a commentary saying populist democracy will tend to go down the primrose path. He liked the P's as well. Primrose path of inadequately funded social security programs, but when population growth slows down so that we no longer have the comfortable Ponzi rate of growth, the thorns along the primrose path reveal themselves. So in Canada, what happened during that period? Well, lots of things, but in the four areas I'm focusing on, pressure of seniors' benefits on the federal budget led Mike Wilson, when he was finance minister, to try to act as policeman, suspending OAS indexation, but confrontation with the participants aborted that one. The CPP and QPP also resisted reform during that period. There was a 1980s review, but it just basically sanctioned a big increase in contribution rates to sort of keep pace with the pay-as-you-go cost. And the CPP advisory board regularly told everybody, your benefits are good, they're going to be paid. So I put that under the perpetuating Ponzi heading. Occupational pensions, they evolved quite a bit during this period. Many participants wanted out because with returns on investments yields as high as they were, many people felt they could do better on their own. So in the private sector, we saw some movement away from defined benefit to defined contribution plans. And the people who found themselves offside, sort of peradventure Ponzi's, a lot of them started to fund their plans better during this period with good returns helping them do it. Toward the end of the period, the public sector also moved in important ways. In the provincial public sector, if you think of Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, for example, this is the period when they transitioned from unfunded to largely funded. So the intergenerational transfers that were already in those plans kind of got baked in. They didn't get undone, but these changes kind of contained it. So the police curbed their growth. I said I would talk about healthcare as well. Very different story there, continued on the previous path. Back in 1984, the Canada Health Act sort of erased a lot of the remaining social insurance-like features of provincial systems. And I don't think at that point, others may know, but I don't recall that there was any discussion at that point about demographic aging creating problems. That was a discussion for the future. With government budget balances, it's a bit more like occupational pensions, a lot of undoing of what had happened earlier because we had chronic deficits, we had rising debt, the apparent tax price of services rose because of all the interest payments, and the fiscal police arrived. And so in the early 1990s, there were big fiscal consolidations in several major provinces, and then right at the end of the period, 1995, the federal government started to do it as well. So that closes off my discussion of that second period. Now, 1995 to the present. Looking back, the financial crisis and the slump of 2008 and 2009, punctuate that period in a dramatic way. But if you look at the trends over the 20 years, you can see some things over the entire period. Growth in the working age population slowed further, as did growth of output and incomes. Yields on assets now decline. If you think we've got one good benchmark, particularly because the federal government issued its real return bond in the early 1990s, and it was yielding around 5% at one point, then 1995 about 4%. By the late 90s, by the mid 2000s, it was down to 2%, and as of yesterday, I think it was about 0.5. So those are important changes, and they brought some peradventure Ponzi problems to light. But also we saw some more work by the deponzification police. Even on seniors' benefits, which were hard to do anything about, but we did have the previous government legislate an increase in the normal age of receipt for OAS benefits to take effect during the late 2020s. And the CPP and the QPP got huge overhauls. The late 1990s reforms trimmed prospective benefits, and critically, they ramped contribution rates up ahead of the pay-as-you-go rate. And the idea was build a provident fund that's large enough that you can forestall further rate increases. In the CPP's case, hold it at 9.9%. And I supported those changes, had done some work showing how that kind of a stabilization program could work, and I was very pleasantly surprised that that package went through. And it did stabilize the unfunded liability. If you go back to the time of the reform package, the yield on the real return bonds, so sovereign grade inflation indexed asset, was about 4%. That's what the chief actuary projected the CPP investment board could earn on assets in the plan. Those calculations showed, they showed that you could hold the rate at 9.9%. At the time, using those returns, the calculation was about 6% of that 9.9 is each participant pre-funding her or his own benefits. The other part of it is kind of amortizing the unfunded liability that Ponzi left behind. And so that was great. And against the background of declining yields, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board earned better than projected returns through most of the period. And so that's also great. Now, the decline in yields on safe assets, though, has other implications. And I'll turn now to occupational pensions. So during this 20-year period, 1995 to the present, occupational pensions continued to evolve. And a notable further change in the public sector was at the federal level, because in 2000, the federal government began to pre-fund newly accruing benefits in its largest plans. So we've now got some funding happening in a lot of the major public sector plans. The capital gains that were supported by declining yields early on, though, initially everything looked great. The declining yields themselves began to turn some of the pension industry into peradventure Ponzi's. You had what was called the financial economics school that was warning that this tradition of discounting liabilities based on your assumed return on assets understated the true and rising cost of pension promises. That was something else David Lather and I worked on together in the late 90s. And the perpetuating Ponzi's, apologies for the term, but they fought this. They didn't have a lot of success in the private sector, where the possibility of bankruptcy and the need to discharge your obligations, if that happens, kind of brought that fair value approach into more favor. So now we've got more accounting in the private sector, and it shows that pension plans finished that period in pretty rough shape. But in the public sector, the opposition to the fair value approach has been much more successful. Access to the taxpayer, maybe you don't need to worry about your need to actually pay off the liabilities. And in the case of the CPP, hardly anyone, and certainly not the advocates of expansion, seem to have noticed the implication of these very low yields for that type of a plan. I've been mentioning healthcare as well. That during the last 20 years is an area where the conversation did change. Not necessarily that easily, but we started to get systematic data on the age profile of healthcare expenditures. And various researchers, including David Dodge and some of us at the C.D. Howe Institute, started to crank out these projections that showed that aging mattered. And there was a fierce debate over whether that was true or relevant. I think some of the people who are resisting the message from that are, maybe in the perpetuating camp, and so far they've largely held off any move to try and do something about that. We've seen some changes. British Columbia and Quebec, for example, are provinces that have taken some steps to mitigate the impact of aging. But if you look across the country, the age profile of public spending in healthcare is essentially the same now as it was in the late 90s. So there hasn't been a massive change there. With regard to budget balances, the fourth area that I've been commenting on, notwithstanding pressures from healthcare, and except for the immediate impact of the crisis and the slump, and actually with the conspicuous exception of Ontario, Government budgets ran close to balance during that period, and public debt fell relative to GDP. Interest payments as a share of GDP way down. So at that level, the Ponzi police, if you'll go with my analogy, did a pretty good job. So where do we stand now? With growth slow and yields on safe assets even lower, the idea that we should live for the moment might have gained a bit of appeal. And the question I want to explore in the rest of my prepared remarks is how much dealing with the residual Ponzi in some of the areas I've discussed might affect the living standards of today's youngsters as they grow up, and whether fresh Ponzi might worsen the outlook. Now, ideally, I would try to do this in a comprehensive way, on a common standard, as generational accounting tries to do. That's a tough thing to do. It seems not to be very popular. You have to grind through a lot of data. Some very eminent people, Larry Kotlikoff, have promoted this approach. It hasn't really taken off, and I'm afraid I'm not going to do that here. I'll give you a partial approach, and if you find it interesting, then if it sparks some interest, then I'd be very happy. Because to get to the main point, I think that the outlook for growth of output and incomes over the next few decades is subdued enough that even small slices out of that incremental income could matter. And the moral imperative to avoid playing Ponzi is as important as it ever was. So what kind of a baseline to start with? I'm going to start where many people do. If you look at the demographics, just looking from 1990, for example, the population of working age, and I'm going to define that more broadly than people often do, 15 to 69, it's grown about 1.1% annually. And over that same period, real output and incomes using GDP went up 2.3%. So GDP per working age person up 1.2%. The demographic challenge, just to pause on that for a moment, thinking about the same numbers, the total population since 1990 rose at about the same rate as the working age population, a smidgen less. So GDP per person went up at about the same rate. It's a smidgen more, but that's basically what happened over that period. But over the next 15 years, and I'm shortening the horizon because the further out you go, the more speculative this stuff gets. But the working age population that I just defined will essentially flatline, zero growth. The total population growing at the upper end is going to go up by about 0.6 annually. So right away, there's a question of spreading the incremental output generated by the working age population over the entire population. There's, arithmetically, you can see that there's a bit of a challenge there. Now, how much incremental output might there be? The simple projection, which seems very popular, I'm looking at Hugh, remembering some modeling work that he did on economic growth a while back, so I'm going to come nowhere near that standard. But what a lot of people do is they say, okay, well, labor productivity, like I just said, grew 1.2% annually in the past, so it's going to keep doing that in the future. Slightly less simple, although very fraught, is if you put together a model with labor and capital. I want to talk about national saving later, so I will admit that I sat down with a spreadsheet and I slapped something together, sort of duct tape and wire. My definition of national net worth is from StatsCan's national balance sheet, all non-financial assets and net foreign holdings. And if I translate that into 2007 dollars using the GDP price index as a measure of capital, what I get is that it grew 4.2% annually since 1990. And that implies a saving rate, if you think of the increase in that stock as a share of each year's GDP, of about 15% of GDP, net saving rate. Okay, what do you do with that? Well, a production function, this is on a spreadsheet. I put weights of 0.75 on labor and 0.25 on wealth. This is totally mechanical. There's no behavior in this model. I'm just grinding out a result. What that does is it gives you an index of inputs rising 2% annually since 1990 and residual productivity growth of 0.3 to explain 2.3% GDP growth. Why did I do this? Well, I have one justification for using these odd weights on capital and labor, and that is that StatsCan's measure of capital contains more than produced capital. It's got land and natural resources, so it's bigger than the usual measure. But mainly I did it because if I let growing wealth explain growth since 1990 with the usual coefficients, I get no residual productivity growth at all. And if you project without that 0.3% into the future, It's horrendous. So I had to damp down the effective wealth, and then I nudged the future saving rate up just a little bit so that the stock of wealth with those coefficients would grow fast enough to yield 1.2% growth per person. So that was a contrived result. But since everybody's predicting 1.2%, I want to huddle behind the crowd. Anyway, so that's the impressive foundation for future income growth of 1.2%. So let's let the various Ponzi's get to work on that and see how much future workers might get to enjoy for themselves. Now, for seniors' benefits, we've got projections from the chief actuary, and happily, these were prepared right after the legislation to raise the retirement age. So they're quite current, and they give us a snapshot of the impact of that. What they show with the changes, if their age goes up, is that the share of GDP required to fund OAS and GIS and the other stuff that goes along with that, it rises by about 0.35% between 2015 and 2030. Now, the chief actuary has the same 1.2% growth in real wages in his model. I love seeing that number. It's very reassuring. He also, though, has big increases in employment rates, and I don't know about that. My projections are less robust, and so the increase in share of GDP, the way I'm projecting it, would be about 0.7%. So it's bigger than what the chief actuary has. But if you think of that as a straight transfer from young to old, on an annual basis, it's maybe shaving 0.02, 0.05, 2.5 basis points off annual growth rates. So that's post-police. We had some Ponzi-ish promises about seniors' benefits in the recent federal election. The first one was to bring the age of OAS receipt back down. Again, the chief actuary's report models that explicitly. So you can go to his report and it shows the impact. It basically doubles the increase in GDP that you'd expect over the period. The decline and the increase in age, cut it in half relative to what it was before, put the age back up, it doubles it. So about 0.7. A couple of other things. The Liberals promised to enhance the GIS. Fine, adds a little bit. They also, I have to complain about this, they promised a new seniors price index and to index seniors benefits to whichever of it or the CPI rises more during a given period. I'm at a university. So in October, when StatsCan rolls all the tuition increases into the October CPI, the seniors will get compensated for the tuition they're not paying. Anyway, that's irritating. Doesn't add up to a ton, but it's a move in the wrong direction, a few more basis points of appropriation. If you think of that, and this is I could be challenged on this, but if you think of these payments as a straight transfer from the young to the old, then add all this stuff up, and with the less robust projections of GDP, you might get to 0.1% of annual growth that's going to go over into that hopper. What about the CPP and the QPP? I praised the reform packages earlier. Most other countries in the world would give a lot to be able to do what we did. It was a very important change. One of the problems, though, is that people immediately took to using the term full funding to describe the situation where you can keep the 9.9% contribution rate stable. And that's a problematic term. The CPP isn't fully funded. It's still largely pay-as-you-go. The idea of the ramping up the contribution rates was to provide a little bit of a buffer to be able to hold the rate steady. But that required 4% real yields. And yields on assets of the quality that people think of when they think about the CPP's promise, I mean, that's a pretty serious hand-on-heart promise, right? It's not contingent. There's some possibility that indexing gets suspended, but I don't think most people consider that seriously. So it's a serious commitment. And yields on real return bonds, as I mentioned, have gone much. So there's another indexed asset, have gone far down. If returns are equal to current safe yields or even equal to the real rate of economic growth of 1.2%, whatever it might be, or even 2%, you can't sustain the 9.9% contribution rate with that. Now, the chief actuary doesn't do sensitivity analysis of rates as low as I think would be appropriate, yields as low as I think would be appropriate. But basically, it doesn't matter. If they go down much below 3%, what happens is you converge with the pay-as-you-go rate. Probably then the CPP just goes back to the pay-as-you-go rate, which in 2030, the chief actuary puts at 10.7%. For reasons that wouldn't be interesting for me to elaborate, it's hard for me to adjust my model to to adjust the chief actuary's projections with my model's less robust growth. But there are some sensitivity calculations in the chief actuary's report that on the last report on the CPP that suggests the pay-as-you-go rate with the less robust growth might be somewhere a little bit more than 11%. If I treat the QPP in parallel fashion, anyone from Quebec, I apologize. I know that's a little bit shorthand. What you basically get is the amount of GDP that workers in 2030 would pay into these plans were that to transpire would probably be about half a percentage point higher than today. So on an annual basis, not a huge number, about 0.04 percentage points annually. Now CPP, so again, a small potential slice out of that income growth. CPP expansion was also in the Liberal platform, and the Ontario government has a proposal for its own plan. I'm concerned about those proposals because they involve promising benefits on the basis of a 4% real return. And as I just was saying, we're in an environment where yields on assets that are suitable for backing a promise like that are much lower. So I think that means accruing some fresh unfunded liabilities. And I'll come back to that in a moment in my discussion of public debt. Meanwhile, what about occupational pensions? They are many and varied, and a lot of them are pretty opaque. So I do not have any kind of estimate of the bite that covering their deficits might take out of future earnings. But there will be one. Private sector pension plans even can socialize some of their losses under extraordinary circumstances. In Ontario, we've got a pension benefit guarantee fund, not very generous, but there's some potential for it to go that way. But public sector plans already socialize their losses. It's rare to see a budget season where you don't see at least one province topping up a pension deficit somewhere. We've got some very big problems in this area. The federal plans are unique in that they're large and their benefit promises are totally unconditional. They're pure DB. They're not like Ontario Teachers or some of the other broader public sector plans where the benefit is contingent on funded status. So the obligations of the federal government's plans resemble the real return bond very closely. Now, all these plans were unfunded until 2000, as I mentioned earlier. Since then, the three biggest ones have collected contributions and invested in assets. And if you look at the federal government's public accounts, they report a net pension liability as of last fiscal year of $150 billion. The problem, though, is that they are discounting their obligations, including the obligations from the unfunded days. There are no assets in these plans to earn these returns, but they're still saying 4% real. And as Alex Laurent and I have shown, the fair value approach, if you think of that as an obligation just like any other debt obligation, the unfunded liability is about $270 billion, so $120 billion higher. And that already is getting amortized into the public accounts. It didn't get a lot of attention, but when Bill Morneau gave the fiscal update, he did highlight that there was considerably higher ongoing spending, about $1 billion a year higher. That wasn't any initiative the government took. It was because they recognized the higher cost of these pensions in one little slice, and it added $1 billion a year to compensation. Another $2 billion went straight into the debt without even showing up in the deficit. So that's, but anyway, I mean, if a comprehensive view of the budget would have shown that the debt just went up. And there's a lot more where that came from. So somehow or other, this is going to have to get paid off. Now, I don't propose that this is how it would happen, but here's just one way of thinking about it. Suppose in 35 years' time, the retirees from the unfunded days pre-2000, they'll be basically gone. If you think about amortizing the existing unfunded liabilities from the post-2000 arrangements over a 35-year period, it's probably not insanely off. So anyway, it's a potential number to work with. I'm not talking about new promises being made. That's important. There are still new liabilities being manufactured, but I'll hold off on that till I get to the discussion of public debt. So we got a $270 billion liability that might get amortized. I don't think it would get amortized this way, but if it was done straight line over 35 years, that'd be about 0.3% of GDP annually, so that's a big number. Not a very plausible scenario, but it gives you a sense of the scale. More likely what happens is it gets translated into debt. The payments come due, the federal government issues more debt, pays the pensions that way. But bear in mind, I'm talking only about federal pensions. Federal government's pension problem is big, but it's a relatively minor public sector employer. Most of the public sector employees in the country are not working for the federal government. And although many of those plans are flex benefits, some of them are less aggressive, some of them are better funded, there are a lot of them. So one way or another, there is a cash requirement out there that's not recognized in government reports, and paying it off is bound to shave some income off what the next generation would otherwise enjoy. Let me talk about healthcare, because I think this is less controversial. I mean, David, Colin Busby, and I have, lots of other people have now done a lot of these types of projections, and the answers typically come out the same. If you look at services per person, you let them grow at the same rate as productivity in the economy, so service intensity goes up at the same rate as output more generally, and you say the same thing about cost. Cost inside the healthcare sector, same rate of inflation as outside it. So all that changes is demography. Typically what you would get over the time horizon I'm talking about is the share of GDP going on provincial and territorial healthcare budgets would go from about 7.5% to 9.7% of GDP. So that jump over 15 years would be about 0.15 of GDP annually. Is that entirely an intergenerational transfer? I don't know. That's a stretch. But all I'm letting vary in that is the demography. Right? That's the only thing that's changing when I calculate that increase of GDP. And for people who follow these types of projections, I said one thing that might have clanged. I said healthcare cost inflation, same as in the rest of the economy. To judge by the data we have, and the data aren't that great, that's not the case. Cost inflation inside the healthcare sector tends to exceed cost inflation elsewhere, so maybe it raises the amount to 0.2% annually. So that's not a small amount. Finally, there's the public debt, or more precisely, the cost of servicing it. So the fourth thing that I've been highlighting. Now, there are certain things here I don't want to count. It's a bit like the cost of seniors benefits already. That's baked in. I didn't count what's already there. Already earned pensions. If healthcare doesn't result in fresh borrowing, I don't want to count that again. The current cost of servicing public debt is already in the tax rates we're paying, so that's kind of baked in. So what's worth looking at? People often focus on the risk of rising interest rates, and certainly that was a major preoccupation of mine once upon a time. But I won't dwell on it now. For those who want to hear the numbers, Canadian governments are paying about $64 billion in interest annually nowadays on about $1.3 trillion of net financial obligations. Now, it's a very crude calculation to compare one to the other, but it works out to an interest rate of 5%, an effective interest rate of 5%. Bond yields are below that right now. Economic growth being as slow as it's likely to be, I don't feel comfortable trying to scare people with a big interest rate increase. If you had European-style fears about a default, sort of the classic fiscal Ponzi game, well, that's different. But for now, that's all I'll say on the subject. I wouldn't count anything in from that. There is new borrowing to think about, though. So the Liberals promised deficits. Right now, the debt to GDP ratio seems to be the constraint. That would let them borrow about $20 billion a year, which from what we're seeing is probably what we're going to be seeing in the next budget. Provincial governments are also currently borrowing at about that rate. What else? Well, I want to go back to employee pensions. As I hope you recall, what I discussed so far was the unfunded liabilities that are already out there. But these pension plans are accruing new obligations all the time. And the inflated discount rates that they use also make those, what they're showing in their accounts, too low. That's why the cost of federal government employment that Bill Morneau reported in the fall update was suddenly higher than it had been before, because they recognized a bit of this. So if you look at the public accounts, the cost federally of the new pension and other benefits accruing annually is about $10 billion. But as Alex Loran and I showed, if you use a discount rate that's equal to the economic growth rate or the RRB yield, the true value of those annual accruals is at least double that. Now, the total gap between all public sector pension accruals as reported and what a fair value calculation would be has got to be considerably larger than 10 to 15 billion, because the federal government is a relatively small employer. I don't know what the number is. I'll say maybe it's 25 billion. But if you add up those new borrowing things I was talking about, the deficits and so on, it is enough to raise the debt to GDP ratio a little bit. I wouldn't put a high yield on that new notional debt. The resulting increases in the interest bill aren't that large. But Ponzi's kind of working away on that front still. It's a few basis points of income a year, perhaps. If the unfunded liabilities that I mentioned earlier do end up getting just translated into new debt, payments come due, government issues new bonds, to pay them, then you've got a few more basis points of higher interest costs to nibble away at income growth as well. Now, having warmed up with occupational pensions, let me go to potential expansion of the CPP. I already said that I have a problem with the phrase fully funded in relation to the CPP, and that misapplication of the term really matters when we're thinking about what the expansion might look like. If there were a money purchase top-up, so the CPP Investment Board collects extra money from you, invests it, pays whatever, then that's fully funded. It's a defined contribution plan. But if people mean a defined benefit based on the same 4% real return that the chief actuary is currently using in his projections when assets of suitable quality to back that promise are yielding way less, that's premeditated Ponzi. We don't know what CPP expansion would look like, but the Ontario, well, actually, we don't even know what ORPP expansion would look like. I can't believe this thing is supposed to start next January and the government still hasn't released just like a plan that would show us money in, money out. However, the Conference Board of Canada they were commissioned by the Ontario Ministry of Finance, and the data that the ministry supplied them showed contributions in 2030 of about 8 billion, which if you scale that up, like suppose that's the model for the CPP, scale it up nationally, it'd be about 21 billion or 0.6% of GDP. So the ORPP is assuming real net returns of at least 4% to pay the promises the benefits that it promises. That's very aggressive with the RRB yield, the real return bond yielding like 0.5, 0.6, real growth of say 1.2. You can add a premium for credit quality, it's provincial. You could add a bit more for the risk that the benefits don't get indexed. But I mean, suppose you jack appropriate rate up to 2% real. Well, we don't have a model, so we don't know what the term of the liabilities would be, but I like 35 years because it makes the arithmetic easy. The cost of funding a benefit with a 35-year term at 2% real is double what it would be with 4% real. So that means, if I have my head straight on this, that the plan would be accruing obligations at twice the rate that it's funding them. Right? They're charging half what it actually costs. CPP expansion along the same lines, same kind of calculation. So when people say fully funded, they mean on the basis of real returns close to 4%. But again, if the CPP were to expand benefits on that basis, it seems to me they would be charging less than half of what the benefits are worth. And that might sell politically, right? That's a very attractive thing. That's why Ponzi, had investors. But it does mean adding liabilities. So what I did, not knowing how to handle this in a way that was any more sophisticated than this, I thought, okay, well, why don't I just think of that as potential additional borrowing as well? It's a bit of a shortcut, but think of the ORPP. In its first years, the administrative costs could be very, very high relative to the contributions and benefits if anybody's looked at what they're projecting. How does that get paid for? They said it's going to be paid within the plan. Well, I don't know. Probably the government pays for it and pays for it with newly issued debt. So you can see how the line between these things could be permeable. So if it is 0.6% of GDP annually, apply, say, a 4% nominal rate to that new debt, it does raise interest costs. Not by very much. I don't want to overstate this. It's a few more basis points, maybe 2 basis points annually. So anyway, those are the areas that I thought were worth covering. Can you tally it all up? Well, I warned you there might be some gaps and misconceptions in my attempt here to assemble my various thoughts about intergenerational issues. I don't assert that everything I've said is that you can treat them all equally, and I don't think it's suitable to add up the various numbers that I just said as though they are additive. But just to recap the relative magnitudes, this is what I came up with. So again, the focus here is between now and 2030. What shares of GDP, what kind of potential erosion of the incremental growth might we see from various influences? Seniors benefits, probably 0.02, 0.03, 2 or 3 basis points annually if left alone. Could be higher, maybe I can get not quite to 0.1% annually if we have some enhancements. CPP and QPP, 3 to 4 basis points if left alone. The existing unfunded liabilities of government sector pensions, as I said, amortizing them over the sort of lifetimes, average lifetimes of the participants, 0.3% of GDP, that's a big number. Probably wouldn't happen that way. Publicly funded healthcare, 0.15% of GDP annually. Maybe 0.2 if you allow for the cost increases, and treat it all as a transfer. Interest on public debt, probably not much. A few basis points annually as long as yields don't rise, and I'm not assuming they do. New obligations as a result of ORPP or CPP expansion, same amount, few basis points annually. So before wrapping up and taking your comments and questions and corrections, I have one final point to make, and that's about the potential impact of these things on my baseline growth rate. I don't feel confident saying anything about how financing some of that from tax might affect output. Governments might deploy damaging taxes to fund the incremental amounts, but they might not. I mean, Canadian experience over the period I've been canvassed could support either prediction. In the case of the ORPP or the CPP expansion, people have talked about this as a payroll tax, but remember, for the recipients, they're getting double what they're having to pay for. So that's a pretty sweet deal. They're not going to complain. So the adverse impact of financing some of these things on output and its growth, I'll note it. I think it's worth thinking about, but I don't have anything much more than that to say that it's a cautionary thing. What I do think is probably worth paying attention to is the potential impact of some of what I've mentioned on national saving and the future stock of wealth. When governments float debt to finance consumption, I don't think we should expect multipliers and Ricardian offsets, which work against each other anyway, to offset much of the impact on national saving. And especially when we're talking about accruing unfunded liabilities, because in those cases, the pension things, the person who's being promised the benefit is acutely aware of the value in a way that the person who might have to pay it further down the road is not. Because remember, the accounting isn't actually telling you the true cost, so I don't think people see through that. So having said that there's some concern about national saving here, just an illustrative number, and I've gone out on several limbs already, so I'll hit calc on my spreadsheet one more time and compound the damage. I don't suggest that this is a sophisticated exercise. But if I were to add up some of the things I've talked about, these potential budget deficits and increases in unfunded obligations, it might sum to about 3% of GDP annually between now and 2030. So I have my duct tape and wire model of the economy with wealth growing. I ding the saving rate down by that amount, and it slows real output growth down. I have a low coefficient on capital, but it lowers output growth by about 0.1% annually. So one more thing about that, most of the things I've talked about wouldn't drop proportionally, so relative to some of the things that might erode that growth, they grow a little bit if the underlying growth is less. Now, we can't add those up, all the different things I talked about, but if we are talking about growth of not much more than 1% annually, you don't have to take all of them into account. You don't have to be very aggressive in adding them up to get what's potentially available for tomorrow's workers down considerably lower than 1% and maybe closer to nothing. So I said I would hold my remarks to an hour, and I think I'm just about there. So pending corrections, a few closing observations on this attempt to survey the intergenerational scene. First, I mean, the obvious thing, I picked this topic, so I think it needs fresh attention. The legacy of past Ponzi games in Canada is not as severe as it is in many other countries, most countries, certainly in Europe, say. But we want young Canadians to experience the same expanding opportunities that their parents and grandparents did. And that means addressing some of the things that deliberately or inadvertently might have been put in place to hold them back. So pending somebody picking up the generational accounting torch and sort of doing this comprehensively, just a few notes from me. The potential impact of seniors benefits, even enriched, or the CPP on future living standards isn't massive. When I was doing the calculations, I didn't know what to expect, and I was kind of relieved that I came up with numbers as small as I did. But the changes are in the wrong direction. And so improving the prospects for the next generation, I mean, just to make an obvious point, we shouldn't be talking about bringing the age of receipt for OAS back down. We should be talking about increasing it more in line with life expectancy. We need better accounting. We need better accounting and more fair value measures for assessing stocks and accruals of pensions and other future benefits. The legacy of using assumed returns on assets to discount liabilities, including in unfunded plans where the assets that would earn those returns don't even exist. I mean, this is giving us a very distorted view of the value of the promises that have been made already and of the value of the promises that we're making as we go. And it legitimates Ponzi-like approaches to new plans, as I hope I argued persuasively with regard to the CPP and the ORPP. With healthcare, I think we need to approach the stresses that demography creates for healthcare with more urgency. The rising profile of health costs with age is sometimes a result of policies. If we're giving things to seniors that other people have to pay for, so you can change that. Where it's a natural consequence of aging, as it is with long-term care, there's still time to pre-fund it. A lot of those expenses are still far enough in the future that we could pre-fund. You don't get big returns on investment anymore, but it's a discipline. It makes sure that you're thinking about what these things are actually going to cost when the day comes when you have to pay them. There's still time to kick something in for the late boomers to kick something in extra. And then finally, sort of thinking of Hugh and David's work, and many others here, I'm sure, have done work on economic growth, but in the public discourse, it does not get much attention. Next quarter's GDP, that gets lots of attention. When I was preparing this lecture, I had a lot of moments of existential doubt, especially when I was throwing together the time series and the spreadsheet. Very, as I said, duct tape and wire. So I don't feel confident about the numbers that I said, but it's striking how little work in the public discourse is happening, and how that sort of 1.2 number was the one I felt I should shelter behind. I had trouble getting to it, right? If you put wealth into the equation, I had trouble getting to it. So maybe my projection's too gloomy. If real incomes per worker in the future rise 2.5% real per year, then we can Ponzi away and we can premeditate with clear consciences. It'll be fine, right? But on the other hand, if it's lower, if I'm too rosy, then those potential eroders I'm talking about loom quite a bit larger. Today's youngsters are in for a rough time, and the perpetuating Ponzis who saw problems and didn't deal with them, they'll have a lot to answer for, including potentially to the Ponzi police in the future. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it for my prepared remarks. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have some time for questions. If anybody would like to offer a question, I can come over with the microphone here.
Thank you. Just returned from Denmark.
Sorry, which?
I just returned from Denmark with my wife's family. My niece is a university student. She gets paid to go to university. Take note of that. The social benefits are extremely generous. They have a universal pension plan, health care. Nobody sleeps on the street. My Danish family seems to be doing everyone is doing okay. Have they found the magic bullet? And if so, maybe we should be studying how they're doing it. Or is the national ship of Denmark and Sweden and Norway headed towards the big crash on the rocks? I realize my question may be unfair because it's
No,
about Denmark and not Canada, but thank you.
Well, given my tentativeness in commenting on even on Canada after having spent a lot of years looking at it, I certainly don't feel confident saying anything definite about what's happening in parts of Europe. I get in all kinds of trouble. My wife's of Greek extraction, so whenever I mention Greece, I hear about it from my in-laws. But one of the comments made about Greece in the earlier days of the crisis was the cafes are still full. I mean, it seems okay. So it's sometimes you can't tell just by looking at it. One of the things that they have done in some of the Scandinavian countries, and I'm not sure about Denmark, so I don't know if this is directly on point, but on the social security programs, they've changed their benefit formula to account for the impact of aging. And I think that's a great idea. It sounds technically exotic, like it sounds like it'd be hard to explain to people and maybe hard to get people to accept, but they've managed to do it. So in that respect, they have mitigated some of the intergenerational pressure that otherwise would exist. And when you look at European demography, that's a good thing. The other thing that's, and again, I'm sorry, I don't know for sure about Denmark, but in the Netherlands, this is an important feature that they've moved their social security system onto a contingent basis, so the benefits do have some flexibility depending on the funded status of the plan. And I think both of those things just make a lot of sense. You're not reneging on the promise. There's no sort of abrupt cutting off, but what you've signaled to people in advance is that there will be some adjusting factors. And I think those are great things to do. So whether Denmark, in terms of the overall condition of the welfare state's in good shape or not, I don't know. The latest news out of Europe is a little worrying again. But they have definitely done some good things that I think we could learn from.
Enjoyed your talk. It's quite depressing listening to it. But if you're on the other side, how should a pension fund be invested? How should an endowment fund be invested? That of Queen's.
I would answer the question differently for endowment and pension. But and this is an area, I shouldn't put words into David Dodge's mouth, but he and I have had quite lively discussions about this. I think that if you have a defined benefit pension plan, you have put your hand on your heart and you've said, I'm going to pay these benefits. It's not contingent. It's a very firm promise, and the appropriate asset with which to back that promise is not mining stocks. It's not currency futures. It's an asset that resembles, with cash flows and the reliability of those cash flows as closely as the world allows. Now, people object to that. They say there's a lot of volatility if you do that. Fair value accounting that drives you to that before you're matched. You get a lot of volatility in the balance sheet. Once you're there, it costs. I mean, they say it costs a lot. That's another way of saying you have to save a lot in order to provide a pension like that, which is true. So I've often been challenged by people saying, what do you do in a situation like that? How do you fund a promise like that? And my answer would be, don't make the promise like that. Make a contingent promise. Put some flex in the benefits the way that many of the broader, whether they've got enough flex, I don't know. Ontario Teachers is kind of up against the limit of theirs. But there are other ways that you could do it that would be, I think, a more complete contract with the pensioner. For an endowment, I know there are some people in the room who are pretty shrewd investors, and I wouldn't take anything away from what they're doing. So if it's clear to the potential recipients that it's a money purchase kind of arrangement, then there are lots of strategies that value investors seem to have pursued with great success. But if your promise is a really, really firm one, then I think you should match that liability with an asset that resembles it as closely as you can. And if that means much higher contributions, guarantees cost money. That's usually the way things work. Okay.
So have you done a sensitivity analysis on that assumption? Because if we look at the real rate of return on a whole basket of other assets, it seems that almost all of your negative news comes from the very American-like, let's put our hand over our heart and match the asset to the liability. If you relax that assumption, how quickly does what you're saying begin to unravel?
In the case of in the case of a promise, like I focused a lot on the federal government's real return bond because it's the best credit quality in Canada and it's indexed to inflation. So it's got a couple of critical characteristics that, among other things, make it very similar to the federal government's pension promises. So I think it's a suitable benchmark to use in thinking about what those promises are worth. If you wanted a pension like what a federal public servant gets, then the asset you would want to hold is the real return bond, and you would have to hold a lot of them, like an amazing amount, much more than tax-deferred saving limits would let you accumulate, but that's another issue. So I think that that's a reasonable place to start. Could returns be higher on other baskets of assets? The CPP Investment Board shot the lights out a number of years in a row. In Japan, the Nikkei index is at roughly half the level it was in 1989. So I have no firm basis for saying what returns are likely to be over the very long run. When it was Elroy Dimson and Marsh did their book, The Triumph of the Optimist, their first sample was pretty heavily weighted with the same data that the people who first calculated an equity premium had looked at. A relatively small number of countries over a relatively small period of time, not a lot of attention to getting rid of survivor biases and so on. The wider they've cast their net over time, the less certain they've become of their confidence that you can earn these types of returns over long periods of time, because the early samples left stuff out. Like if you owned shares in Germany or Italy or Japan in 1945, you were wiped out, and the early studies didn't count that stuff, right? It was rife with survivor bias. I think the more comprehensive studies have become a lot more agnostic on the question as to whether you can really count on these high returns over long periods of time. And even in our own stock market during these bull periods, you can find many periods of years where the market was providing negative returns. So again, I go to the question of what's the quality of the promise you're making? There are certain promises that are unconditional, and if you've got that backed with an asset that doesn't match the promise, then you've got an incomplete contract. And things might work out and everybody's happy, but if things don't work out, nobody's figured out in advance who ends up holding the bag. Does the pensioner, as in Detroit, go short? Does the taxpayer, I mean, it's probably a mix of things, but it's an incomplete contract. Nobody's figured it out. So I like the idea of contingent promises to pay because it makes it a lot clearer to all the parties concerned, you know, what the baseline expectation is, but also what you do if it doesn't work out the way you hoped.
So that was a very long no.
To which, to the,
Which was, have you done a sensitivity analysis that would show how fast your analysis would unravel if you made alternate assumptions about real rates of return?
well, if the real,
Thoroughly plausible based on other asset classes that people have held for long periods of time.
if real returns are 4% forever, then we're in great shape. And in fact, if you know a guaranteed 4% real return, tell me about it, because I will put everything I have into it. At the moment, the world doesn't seem to be offering that.
I can get you one on average real easy.
Well,
I'd be able to do it any individual year. I can get you 4% for life.
well, okay. So I'm going to just pursue this for a moment. So good for you. And with your own money, have fun, right? Like, go for it. I was talking a couple of years ago to some federal government officials about these real return calculations of what the fair value of their pensions was worth. And the answer I got from them was, well, yeah, but real return bond yields are really low now compared to history, and they'll come back. And I thought, okay, well, so short the bond. So, you know, if that's what you think, take a flyer on it. But but the money that you're working with here isn't your own to play with. You're making a very big bet on that bond yield changing using a lot of other people's money and in a very opaque way. As it turns out, the real return bond yield has continued to fall since he made that prediction. So, so far, so wrong. Again, it's just a question of understanding what the contract is. And the difficulty I have with a lot of these arrangements is that people have been told one thing but it's possibly not going to work out the way they're hoping.
Well, just following up on some of these points. I mean, in a sense, you can think of this, sorry, is this on? You can think of the CPP as a combination of a Ponzi scheme and a sovereign wealth fund. So as a Ponzi scheme, it's got a tremendous deficit because it's, projecting returns that are way higher than safe real returns. On the other hand, as a sovereign wealth fund or global hedge fund or whatever you think of it, it's been pretty successful. So the problem is that they're decoupled, and you're arguing they should be coupled. That those who will benefit from Canada Pension, the pensions should actually be coupled to what the CPP succeeds in earning. Right now, they're decoupled, and if really bad things happen, the taxpayers are going to be on the hook for the recipients of the Ponzi scheme because the wealth fund didn't do very well.
The CPP, as it's running right now, is, as I said earlier, I was a big supporter of the reform package, and I continue, like when I'm talking to people from other countries, I say, this is a great way to have gone. I didn't trust the government with the Provident Fund at the beginning. I thought this wouldn't be a sustainable arrangement, but so far it seems to have worked very well, so I'm very happy to have been wrong about that. If you look at the chief actuary's projections and you look at the legislation, it is contingent. I don't think the range of sensitivities is quite as wide as it ought to be, but the projections have a lot of information about how the plan would develop if returns or a bunch of other things turn out to be different. And in the legislation, it says that if the governments can't agree on raising the minimum the contribution rate, the minimum contribution rate to a new higher level if required, then indexation of the benefits will be suspended. So it is contingent. And if you really wanted to press me on using the real return bond on the CPP, I'd say, yeah, I mean, that is an important difference. So my only reservation there would be that people don't really know that. I think most people don't understand that there is this possibility that they wouldn't get full inflation protection, and they've heard it said so often that the plan is fully funded, and everybody's dazzled by what the CPP Investment Board's been able to do so far. So it's very hard to argue that it might not continue to do that. Every prospectus, you have to say past performance, no guarantee of future returns. And what do we do whenever we look at these programs? We always say, oh, well, that's what the past did, so the future is going to be the same. So I'm kind of okay with it the way it is. I wish people understood the fine print a little better, but it's not that it's hidden. It's just that it doesn't attract that much attention. Expanding, it's a different story. As I said, if it were expanded on a money purchase basis so that every cohort kind of got out, its cohort's value of whatever the investment had paid, I can think of problems with that, but there's no Ponzi element to that. If we expanded on the basis of 4% guaranteed forever, then there'd better be some more language in there about what the contingency of the benefit is, because I'm not confident that we can earn 4% real when the real economy is growing much more slowly than that. I don't see where you get those returns. And I know there are a lot of economic models that say the returns will be higher than the economic growth rate because of impatience, but the world right now seems to. Like that sort of says if I have a piece of chocolate in my pocket, I'll eat it instantly because I can't wait, unless it got bigger, right? But people don't actually behave that way. There's a demographic shock. People are reacting to longevity. They're probably saving more. So I don't know. I don't see a very compelling reason for the rate of return to exceed the economic growth rate by a big margin. Sorry, I went a bit off topic.
Okay, just one. I guess you're taking comfort in the fact that. The CPP is organized in such a way that they might not have to index under certain market conditions. But politically, can you imagine those retirees accepting a cut in their pay?
It's hard, yeah. No, it is hard to imagine, and especially right now, because the CPP Investment Board has been earning good returns. Now, what's actually been happening quietly, every time the chief, I exaggerate slightly, but there's a consistent pattern. Every time the chief actuary calculates that the minimum contribution rate's a little bit below 9.9%, there will be some benefit enhancement that kind of, eats up a bit of the margin. So that's been happening over time. but I think right now it'd be quite a shock to people, given the confidence people have in the plan. So in the future, might that atmosphere change? It could, but I'm basically where you are. And so the reason that when I was talking about what might happen in the future, I just said probably we default to the pay-as-you-go rate is because I think that is what would happen. We would raise the contribution rates rather than cutting the benefits. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. A movie that I think is still current in theaters today is called The Big Short. I kind of expect to hear something with that, and given the Ponzi references all the way through, but I'll ask you this. Perhaps a better treatment of the topic of the subprime crisis was a previous documentary called The Inside Job. Don't know if you've seen either of them. But
I've read The Big Short. It's a
okay,
riveting book.
right. Would you care to comment on whether the types of reforms that have been put in, and this may be way outside of your expertise, so no comment is an acceptable answer to this, but would you care to comment on whether the reforms that have been put in place by the regulators since, and whether the political will to execute these reforms has been adequate or not? And perhaps there's an impact on all of what we've been talking about today of whether or not this is appropriate.
That's a multifaceted topic. I mean, some of the financial regulations that have been put in place seem to be coming unstuck even as we speak. But I hope this will be relevant to your question if I say that one of the reasons that I would like to see more fair value accounting in the pension area and related areas is because I think this discounting at high assumed rates of return does tend to push people to take risks that they otherwise wouldn't take. You hear over and over again people say, well, there's benchmarks that people have to hit for a variety of reasons, but in institutional arrangements where you've got to hit some kind of return target, even asset managers who know they're in a crazy environment feel compelled to reach for those targets. So I won't go on further because I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. But there could be a bit of sort of induced appetite for risk here that's unhelpful as a result of the unquestioning use of sort of 4% real in so many situations, when probably a prudent person would have a lower number.
I think this is the last question, I think.
You said that there was yet time to head off the increasing forecast cost of aging, particularly of the baby boom bulge. From my experience, we're having trouble right now. How would you do that? Head it off?
I would certainly, thinking of the pre-funding route, look at certain drug programs. I think are one area that are potentially good to look at. Sort of a social insurance approach. We know on average we're going to need more expensive drug treatments over time. In an actuarial sense, it's predictable. Why not start putting money aside now? Same approaches with the CPP, try and saw off the peak. Long-term care, some of these costs it's not like old age security where, at age 65 or whatever age you do a step change. Many of these costs do occur quite a bit later in life, and people are living longer and healthier lives. So even though the baby boom is not as young as it was, I ought to know, I was born right at the peak in '59, so I guess I'm sort of the exemplar of the problem. A lot of those higher costs really are still a few years down the road, so there's still time to do a little bit about it.
Well, you need access to those 4% returns you just
They would help, but even without them, I think we could do something.
Okay, so just to finish off here, I just want to remind everybody that we're having a reception at the University Club, and everybody's welcome. And finally, I want to give you this gift.
Thank you.
This is very exciting. And say thank you very much.
Thank you.